people assume that by the time you reach old age, the hardest parts of life are already behind you. They think the storms have passed, that what remains is a quiet stretch of days filled with rest, reflection, and the comfort of family. They imagine a soft landing. What they don't see is that some of the most painful losses don't come from enemies or strangers. They come slowly, quietly, to the people you love the most, often without intention, often without awareness, and almost always without warning. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs only to those who have lived long enough to watch their role in the world change without their consent. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives in small moments. A conversation where your opinion is skipped over. A decision made about your life that you were informed of, not included in. A tone in someone's voice that suggests you are no longer fully capable, even when you know you are. These moments seem small on their own, easy to excuse, easy to forgive, but they accumulate, and over time, they begin to reshape how you see yourself. I did not always recognize this happening. In fact, for a long time, I participated in it. I allowed it. I told myself that love meant patience, that being a good parent meant stepping aside, that making things easier for my children was still my responsibility, even in my later years. I believed that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my place. I was wrong about that. And the cost of being wrong was not small. It was not abstract. It was personal, and it was lasting. When you are younger, you think of regret as something tied to missed opportunities. The job you didn't take, the move you didn't make, the words you didn't say. But in old age, regret changes shape. It becomes about what you allowed, what you tolerated, the ways you let yourself become smaller so that others could remain comfortable. And the most difficult part is realizing that much of it happened not because your children were cruel, but because they were busy, distracted, or simply used to seeing you in a certain way. This is why what I am about to say matters more than it might seem at first. If you are in your 60s, your 70s, your 80s, or beyond, and your children are part of your life, there are certain behaviors you must not allow to take root. Not because you don't love them, but because love on its own is not a boundary. Love does not protect you from being diminished, and once certain patterns settle in, they become very difficult to undo. I have seen this happen not only in my own life, but in the lives of women I have known for decades. Strong women, capable women, women who raised families, held homes together, endured loss, adapted to change, and carried more than anyone ever acknowledged. And yet, in their later years, I watched them slowly retreat. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a little at a time. A voice softened here, a preference withheld there, a decision deferred, until one day they were still present, but no longer fully themselves. The tragedy is that it does not have to happen this way. Aging does not require you to surrender your authority, your identity, or your right to be heard. But if you are not careful, if you do not recognize the early signs, it can be taken from you piece by piece in ways that are easy to justify in the moment and painful to see in hindsight. There are 7 things in particular that you need to pay attention to. 7 patterns that may seem harmless, even loving on the surface, but carry within them the potential to erode your independence and your sense of self. These are not dramatic acts of betrayal. They are subtle shifts in behavior, in tone, in expectation. And because they are subtle, they are often ignored until they have already done their damage. The first one is this, and it often begins so gently that you may not even notice it at first. It begins with your children making decisions about your life without truly involving you, not asking for your input in a meaningful way, but presenting you with conclusions that have already been reached. They may frame it as concern, as efficiency, as doing what is best for you, and sometimes the decisions themselves may even be reasonable. That is what makes it so easy to accept. But there is a difference, a profound and important difference, between being cared for and being managed. One preserves your dignity, the other quietly removes it. I remember the moment I first felt that difference, though I did not name it at the time. It was an ordinary afternoon, nothing remarkable about it. the kind of day that would not stand out in memory if not for what was said. My daughter called me, her voice warm, familiar, and she began the conversation in a way that at the time seemed harmless. She said, "We've been thinking about what's best for you." That phrase, "we've been thinking," carries more weight than it appears to, because what it often means is that a discussion has already taken place, conclusions have already been formed, and your role is no longer to participate, but to agree. In that moment, something shifted, though I could not yet explain it. I listened as she described the options they had considered, the plans they had made, the arrangements they believed would make my life easier. She spoke with care, with good intentions. But as she spoke, I realized that my life had been discussed as if it were a problem to be solved, rather than a life to be lived. And I said nothing, not because I agreed, but because I did not want to seem difficult, because I did not want to disrupt what appeared to be kindness, because I told myself that they were only trying to help. That was the moment I should have spoken. That was the moment I should have said, clearly and without apology, "You did not ask me. Start again." When you allow decisions to be made about you without you, you begin to disappear from your own life. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to reclaim your place. This is not about control. It is about presence. It is about the simple, essential right to be included in the decisions that shape your days, even when those decisions are difficult, even when others believe they know better. Because the day you stop being consulted is the day you start being reduced. And reduction, once it begins, rarely stops on its own. The second thing you must never allow is more subtle, and in many ways more dangerous because it disguises itself as care. It begins with a shift in how your children speak to you, not what they say, but how they say it. The tone softens in a way that feels unfamiliar. Instructions are repeated, not once, but twice, sometimes 3 times, as though your understanding is uncertain. Questions are answered on your behalf before you have had the chance to respond. At first, it seems like patience. It seems like attentiveness. But over time, it reveals something else entirely. It is the quiet assumption that your mind is already fading, whether it is or not. This does not happen all at once. No one sits you down and announces it. Instead, it unfolds in small, almost imperceptible moments. A correction here, a gentle interruption there, a sentence finished for you, not out of rudeness, but out of habit. And because each individual moment feels too minor to challenge, you let them pass. You tell yourself it is not worth making an issue of. You tell yourself they mean well. And they do mean well. That is what makes it so difficult to confront. But meaning well does not erase impact. Over time, these small assumptions begin to accumulate, and something inside you starts to shift in response. You begin to hesitate before speaking, wondering if you will be corrected. You simplify your thoughts, not because they are simple, but because you no longer feel there is space for their full expression. You withdraw, just slightly, from conversations you once would have led, and gradually, without anyone explicitly saying so, you are placed into a role you did not choose. The role of someone who is no longer fully trusted with their own mind. I remember sitting in my own living room, a place I had arranged, maintained, and lived in for years, listening as 2 of my children discussed a decision about my daily routine. They spoke kindly, they spoke logically, but they spoke as though I were not there. Not deliberately, not cruelly, but functionally, as if my presence was incidental to the conversation itself. I let them finish before I said anything, and when I did, I kept my voice steady. I said, "I am still capable of answering for myself." They looked surprised, not defensive, not angry, just surprised, as though the idea had not occurred to them that I might need to assert something so obvious. And in that moment, I understood something that had taken me far too long to see. If you do not actively define your capacity, others will quietly redefine it for you. Aging does not mean the disappearance of clarity. It does not mean the erasure of memory, judgment, or insight. Yes, there are changes. There are moments of forgetfulness. There are names that take longer to retrieve, details that blur at the edges, but a mind is not made irrelevant simply because it has aged. In many ways, it is the opposite. It is richer, more layered, more capable of understanding complexity than it has ever been. And yet, if you allow others to treat it as fragile, as unreliable, as something to be managed rather than respected, you begin to internalize that perception. You begin to doubt yourself in ways you never did before, not because you have lost your ability, but because you have been subtly taught not to trust it. This is where the real damage occurs, not in what is taken from you, but in what you begin to surrender willingly. There is a difference between being supported and being diminished. Support respects your autonomy. It steps in when needed, but steps back when not. Diminishment, on the other hand, assumes incapacity before it exists. It replaces your voice with another, your decisions with someone else's judgment, your presence with a quieter, smaller version of yourself. You must recognize that difference early, and you must respond to it clearly. This does not require confrontation in the way people often imagine. It does not require anger or accusation. It requires consistency. It requires you to continue speaking fully even when interrupted. It requires you to answer questions directed at you even when someone else attempts to answer first. It requires you to gently but firmly correct the pattern each time it appears. Because patterns, once established, become expectations, and expectations, once solidified, become roles that are very difficult to step out of. If your children begin to speak for you, you must say, "I will answer." If they repeat themselves unnecessarily, you can respond, "I understood you the first time." If they begin to exclude you from conversations about your own life, you must reinsert yourself, not aggressively, but unmistakably. These may seem like small corrections, and they are, but their impact is not small, because what you are protecting is not just your ability to speak, but your right to be recognized as someone who still possesses a full and active mind. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being physically present, but intellectually dismissed. It is quieter than isolation, but in many ways more painful, because you are not alone, and yet you are not fully seen. I have known women who began to believe they were losing their sharpness simply because they were no longer given the opportunity to use it. Conversations moved around them instead of through them. Decisions were made without their input. And over time, they adapted to that absence by becoming less engaged, less expressive, less themselves. Not because they had to, but because they were taught to. You do not have to accept that teaching. Your mind, with all its history, its memories, its connections, and its understanding, is not something to be quietly set aside. It is not an inconvenience. It is not a relic. It is an active, living part of who you are, and it deserves to be treated as such. If you allow others to treat you as though you are already gone in the ways that matter, you will begin to feel as though you are. And that feeling, once it settles in, is far harder to undo than any single moment that caused it. The third thing you must never allow is this, and it is one of the most quietly damaging patterns of all, because it reaches directly into your sense of worth. Never allow your children to make you feel like a burden for needing help. There is a difference, a clear and undeniable difference, between receiving help and feeling indebted for it. Help, when it is given freely, strengthens connection. It reassures you that you are cared for, that you are not alone, that the years you spent giving have come full circle in a natural and human way. But when help is given with visible reluctance, with sighs, with subtle reminders of inconvenience, it transforms into something else entirely. It becomes weight, and that weight does not sit on the person giving the help. It settles inside you. It does not happen in one obvious moment. It builds slowly. A comment about time, a glance at the clock, a mention of how busy they are, placed carefully into the conversation so it cannot be challenged without seeming ungrateful. Each piece is small, each piece is explainable, but together they create a message that is impossible to ignore. You are costing more than you should. And once that message takes hold, it begins to change your behavior in ways that are both immediate and lasting. You start to hesitate before asking for anything, even when you need it. You measure your requests, not by their necessity, but by how little disruption they might cause. You begin to look for alternatives, not because they are better, but because they are less visible, less demanding, less likely to draw attention to your need. I remember a period in my own life when I began doing exactly this. There was nothing dramatic about it, no argument, no confrontation, no moment that clearly marked the shift, just a series of interactions that left me feeling as though every request I made carried a cost I could not quite repay. My son would drive me to appointments, and he did so reliably. He showed up on time. He followed through. If you were to look at his actions alone, you would say he was doing everything right, but there was always something beneath it, a tension, a commentary on traffic, a reminder of how much he had rearranged to be there. Not harsh, not cruel, just present enough that I could feel it. And after a while, I stopped asking. Not because I no longer needed the help, but because I no longer felt entitled to it. I began taking taxis instead, sitting quietly in the back seat, watching streets I had known for years pass by, telling myself that this was easier, and in some ways it was. Easier than navigating the subtle emotional cost of being helped in a way that made me feel like an obligation. One day, he asked me why I hadn't called. His voice carried confusion, maybe even a hint of hurt. And that told him the truth, though I softened it more than I should have. I said, it was simpler this way. What I meant was that it was lighter, that it did not come with the unspoken calculation of how much I was asking, how much I was taking, how much I was allowed. This is what you must guard against. You have lived a life where giving was not optional. You gave your time, your energy, your attention, your patience, often without recognition, and almost never with expectation of return. You did not track it. You did not present it as sacrifice. You simply did what needed to be done, because that is what was required of you. And now, when the balance naturally shifts, when age brings with it a degree of dependence, you are not stepping outside the natural order of things. You are stepping into the continuation of it. Needing help is not a failure. It is not a moral weakness. It is not something that diminishes your value. It is, quite simply, the arithmetic of a long life. There is a time for giving, and there is a time for receiving. Neither is superior to the other. Both are necessary. But if the help you receive is accompanied by signals, however subtle, that you are creating inconvenience, you must not absorb those signals as truth. You must not let them redefine your sense of what you deserve. And it is not something to quietly work around in order to make others more comfortable. If you allow yourself to believe that your needs are excessive, that your presence is inconvenient, that your requests are too much, you will begin to disappear in ways that are difficult to reverse. And unlike the earlier years of your life, you do not have decades ahead of you to rebuild what has been lost. This is the time to protect what remains, not by withdrawing, but by refusing to carry a weight that was never yours to begin with. The fourth thing you must never allow is your home to be taken over in ways that erase you. This often begins under the most reasonable circumstances. Someone offers to stay with you for a while. Someone suggests small changes to make things easier, safer, more efficient. A chair is moved. A cabinet is reorganized. Something old is replaced with something new. None of it feels serious enough to question. None of it seems worth resisting, and so you allow it, piece by piece, because it appears helpful, even thoughtful. But a home is not just a space. It is a record. It holds the shape of your life in ways that cannot be explained to someone who did not live it. Every object carries memory. Every arrangement reflects a decision you made, a preference you developed, a rhythm you settled into over years, sometimes decades. When those things begin to change without your full consent, something deeper is being altered along with them. You may find yourself walking into a room and feeling for just a moment like a visitor. Not because you are unwelcome, but because something familiar has been replaced with something that does not carry your imprint. And that feeling, if it continues, begins to separate you from the very place that once anchored you. I knew a woman who described this shift in a way I have never forgotten. She said she felt like she was living in a version of her home that had been edited for someone else's comfort, not hers. She was cared for, she was included, but she was no longer centered. And there is a difference between being included in your own home and being rooted in it. If your children begin to rearrange your environment according to their needs, their schedules, their preferences, you must draw a line. Not harshly, not defensively, but clearly. You can say, "You are welcome here, but this space is still mine." That sentence does not reject their presence. It defines yours. Because once your environment stops reflecting you, it becomes easier for everything else to follow. The fifth thing is something that is rarely named, but deeply felt. Never allow your children to absorb your time until you no longer recognize it as your own. This happens gradually. Plans are made around their availability, meals shift to their schedules, your routines begin to bend, then adjust, then disappear entirely. At first it feels like connection. You are spending time together. You are included. You are part of something active and ongoing. But over time, you may notice that your days no longer carry the same texture they once did. The small rituals that defined you begin to fade. The quiet moments you relied on become less frequent. Your time is no longer shaped by your preferences, but by someone else's priorities. And what is lost in that shift is not just routine. It is identity. The way you spend your time is one of the clearest expressions of who you are. When that structure is replaced, even with good intentions, you begin to feel less like yourself and more like an extension of someone else's life. You do not need to reject time with your family to protect this. You simply need to claim parts of your day that remain yours. Specific, non-negotiable spaces that are not open to rearrangement. It can be as simple as a morning kept quiet, an afternoon reserved, a day each week that belongs only to you. Without that, the boundaries blur, and once they blur, they rarely restore themselves. The sixth thing you must never allow is being made to feel that your grief, your emotions, or your inner world are too much for others to accommodate. There is a quiet pressure, especially as you age, to become easier, less expressive, more contained. People do not always say this directly. Instead, it appears in small reactions. A pause when you speak about someone you've lost. A change of subject when you linger too long on something painful. A suggestion, gently delivered, that perhaps it is time to move forward. But grief does not operate on a schedule. Neither does reflection, neither does memory. The life you have lived does not become less significant simply because others have moved on from the moments that still live inside you. If you begin to edit yourself to make others more comfortable, you will slowly lose access to your own emotional truth. And that loss is not visible from the outside, but it is deeply felt within. You are allowed to feel what you feel, for as long as you feel it. You are allowed to speak about it without measuring whether it fits neatly into someone else's comfort. And if others cannot always meet you there, that does not mean you must leave that part of yourself behind. The seventh and final thing is the most important, because it sits underneath all the others. Never allow your children or anyone to reduce you to the role you play in their lives and forget the person you are outside of it. You were not born a mother, you became one. And in becoming one, you may have set aside parts of yourself that did not seem immediately necessary. Interests, opinions, curiosities, versions of yourself that did not fit neatly into the demands of raising a family. But those parts did not disappear, they waited. And if you do not return to them, if you do not reclaim even small pieces of who you were and who you still are beyond your role, you risk becoming defined entirely by how others see you. This is how invisibility truly takes hold, not when others ignore you, but when you begin to accept a version of yourself that is incomplete. I had a moment not long ago when someone asked me a question that had nothing to do with my family. It was simple, almost casual, and I realized in that pause before answering how long it had been since I had considered the question seriously. That pause told me everything. Reclaiming yourself does not require anything dramatic. It does not require a complete reinvention. It begins with attention, with small choices that belong only to you. A book you choose without recommendation, a thought you express without softening, a moment you keep for yourself without explanation. These things may seem insignificant. They are not. They are how you remain visible to yourself. Because in the end, the greatest loss is not what others take from you. It is what you slowly stop claiming. And the only way to prevent that loss is to recognize clearly and without apology that your life is still yours. Not in the past, not in memory,